Hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about 9.0 and it's going to be about factoring, and we're going to talk about the greatest common factor, or the GCF. Okay, so first off, let's talk about the question, what does it mean to factor? So a factor is where we break down a number into products. Okay, and those products are called factors. So break down a number into products. Okay, and that is what is called a factor. So what does that mean? It means if we look at example A, so I'm looking at two numbers, 10 and 15. So if I break down 10 into numbers that multiply to 10, okay, so that would be 2 and 5, and 1 and 10. Okay, and then I would do the same thing for 15. So 15 would be 1 and 15, 3 and 5. And then I look at those and I want to find what number do they have in common, okay, and is that the biggest one. So the number they have in common is 5, so the greatest common factor is 5. Okay, let's look at letter B. So letter B, I'm looking at 27 and 36. So I want numbers that multiply to 27. Well, that would be 1 and 27, and 3 and 9. And then I look at 36. Okay, well, what multiplies to 36? So that'd be 1 and 36, 2 and 18, 3 and 12, 4 and 9, and 6 and 6. Okay? So now I look at all those lists of numbers and I want to find the largest one. So I see everything's going to have a 1 in common, so I'm hoping I get a bigger number than 1. I see they have a 3 in common, but I also see that they have a 9 in common, and that is the largest that they share. So 9 is the greatest common factor. Okay, let's try C. So break down 14. So 1 and 14, 2 and 7. Now let's do 21. 1 and 21, and 3 and 7. What number do they have in common? Well, a 1 and a 7, and which one's bigger? The 7. So the greatest common factor is 7. Okay, so now what happens if we throw a letter in there, like an X? So if I look at D, you treat it exactly the same way. So I look at the numbers and I break them down. So 6 is 1 and 6, and 2 and 3. 3 is just 1 and 3. So their greatest common factor is 3. Now I look at the x's and go, okay, this has an x, but this doesn't. So I don't have anything in common. So the greatest common factor would just be 3. But if I look at E, I see that they both have an x. So if I break down 4 into 1 and 4, and 2 and 2, and I break down 10 into 1 and 10, and 2 and 5, I see that they both have a 2, and I also see that they have an x. So in this case, the greatest common factor will be 2x, because they both share an x. All right, so let's look at a couple more. We'll look at H and I here. So if I look at H, I'm going to break down 27. So things that multiply to 27, well, 1 and 27, and 3 and 9. And then I'm going to break down 45. So 1 and 45, 5 and 9, and 3 and 15. Okay, so I find the greatest common factor between those, and it looks like 9 is the biggest number. So now I have to look at my x's. So I see 27 has 1x, and I see 45 has an x squared, or 2 x's. So they definitely have an x in common, so it'll be 9x. If 27 was x squared, then it would be 9x squared. But since it only has 1x, I can only say they have 1 in common. Okay, let's try I. So break down 20 into 1 and 20, 2 and 10, and 4 and 5. Do the same for 15. So 1 and 15, 3 and 5. Find your greatest common factor. So the only thing that they share is a 5 and a 1. 5 is obviously bigger than 1, so we know that it's going to be 5. Now let's look at our x's. 20 has an x, 15 has an x squared, so they both have an x in common. So it'll be 5x. So finding the greatest common factor is the first step, okay? If I look at example B, what we're going to do is we're going to actually do this thing called factoring, okay? Now, factoring is what we, or I, call reverse distribution, okay? Reverse distribute. So that's like the swoopy lines N or rainbow N, okay? So factoring is the reverse of distribute. Remember in math, everything has to have opposites. Adding has subtraction. Multiplying has dividing. Squaring has square rooting. Well, factoring has distributing, or distributing has factoring. So what we do is we first identify or find the greatest common factor. So we do exactly what we did up above and just ignore the plus sign. So I break down 3x. So 3x just goes to 1 and 3. 12 goes into 1 and 12, 2 and 6, 3 and 4. So my greatest common factor is just 3. Even though it's 3x, 12 doesn't have an x. So I write my greatest common factor in front. And then I'm going to put parentheses around something. So what goes inside the parentheses? Well, reverse distributing means I am pulling out something, okay? What am I pulling out? I'm pulling out the greatest common factor. So I'm pulling out that 3. So 3 times what gets me 3x? Well, 3 times x gets me 3x. 3 times what gets me 12? Well, 3 times 4 gets me 12. And then they were adding, so it would be 3 times x plus 4. That is what we call factoring out the greatest common factor. Okay, let's try B. So break down your numbers. So 5 can be broken down into 1 and 5. And 25 can be broken down into 1 and 25 and 5 and 5. So my greatest common factor is 5. So I'm going to write that in front, wrap it around parentheses. So 5 times what gets me 5x? Well, 5 times x gets me 5x. 5 times what gets me 25? Well, 5 times 5 gets me 25. And then we were minusing, so we put a minus in the parentheses. So 5 times x minus 5. Okay, we're going to go ahead and skip a couple of these, and we're going to jump down to letter E. So E, do the same thing, break it down. So 14 is 1 and 14, 2 and 7. Break down 7 as 1 and 7. Okay, find my greatest common factor. 7, put that in front. Okay, 7 times what gets me 14x? 7 times 2x gets me 14x. 7 times what gets me 7? Well, 7 times 1 gets me 7, and then we were adding. So 7 parentheses 2x plus 1 parentheses. Okay, let's look at G. So G, break down your numbers. So 1 and 6, 2 and 3. Break down 3 as 1 and 3. Greatest common factor is 3. But if I look at G, I have a lot of x's. Compared to A through F, where I only had one x, here each number has an x next to it. So that means my greatest common factor is going to be not just 3, but 3x. Then do your parentheses. 3x times what gets me 6x? Well, I know 3 times 2 gets me 6. And if I have 1x here, that means I need an x outside or inside to get me 2 of them. And then 3x times what gets me 3x? Well, 3x times 1 gets me 3x. So that is going to be 3x times 2x plus 1. Okay, let's try one more and look at I. So I have no numbers at all, except for that minus 3. So I'm not going to have a greatest common factor that involves a number. But if I do notice, they both have an x, so my greatest common factor is just going to be an x. And then I need to know if I have 1 outside, and I need to get an x squared, I should put 1 on the inside. I didn't do anything to the 3, and if I have 1 up here, and I have 1 outside, I don't need any more inside. So then that will be x times x minus 3. Remember that you can always check your answer by redistributing, and if you get the original problem, you are correct. Okay? So you can always check your answers if you rainbow that back in. So example C is looking at what happens when you have a negative number in front. So if you look at all these examples here, now we have a negative in front. So what you do is you do exactly the same thing, only this time your greatest common factor is going to be negative. Okay, so I break down 2 and 6 just like I did normal. So 2 is 1 and 2, 6 is 1 and 6, and 2 and 3. Identify your greatest common factor as 2. But since this is a negative 2, I make it a negative greatest common factor. Then I do my parentheses. So negative 2 times what gets me negative 2x? So negative 2 times x gets me negative 2x. Negative 2 times what gets me negative 6? So that would be a positive 3. So then my final answer would be negative 2 parentheses x plus 3. Okay, let's look at B. Break down negative 3x squared. So 3 just breaks down into 1 and 3. 6, again, we've done this a couple times, breaks down to 1 and 6, and 2 and 3. Identify your greatest common factor. This time it's 3. Since it's a negative out front, we make it a negative greatest common factor. But notice that I forgot that they both have an x. So in fact, my greatest common factor isn't just negative 3, it's actually going to be negative 3x. So negative 3x times what gets me negative 3x squared? Well, negative 3x times x gets me negative 3x squared. Negative 3x times what gets me negative 6x? Well, that's just 2, a positive 2. So it would be negative 3x times x plus 2. Okay, let's jump down to F. Looking at F, I know that my greatest common factor is going to have a negative, and I know that it doesn't have any numbers because there's no number in front of the x squared, so it's just going to be a negative x because they both have an x in common. So negative x times what gets me negative x squared? Well, just x. Negative x times what gets me positive 9? Well, that means I need to know that a negative times a negative is positive. So it would be x minus 9 in parentheses and negative x outside. All right, lastly, looking at example D, now we're going to look at reducing fractions. Okay, so first step is you factor out the numerator and factor the denominator, just like what we did on the last two examples. Then we can reduce and we can cross out anything that they have in common on top and bottom. So, looking at my numerator, 4x minus 12. Identify the greatest common factor. So, I would break down 4 into 1 and 4, and 2 and 2. Break down 12 into 1 and 12, 2 and 6, 3 and 4. Greatest common factor is 4. So that means 4 goes in front, parentheses, 4 times x gets me 4x, 4 times 3 gets me 12, so my top is going to be 4 times x minus 3. Notice that my bottom is already factored for us. There's nothing I have to do. Okay, so now I can just break this down. So step 2, cross out any common factors. So I have an x minus 3 on top and x minus 3 on the bottom. So those cancel out. And now I'm just left with 4 divided by 2. And I know that 4 divided by 2 is 2. So that is my final answer. Now let's look at B. For B, it's very tempting to cross off the 20x's because they're the same. But we can't do that because we're attached to that plus 4. So instead, we got to break down our numerator just like we did over on letter A. So 4, 1 and 4, 2 and 2. Break down 20, 1 and 20, 2 and 10, and 4 and 5. Identify your greatest common factor, 4. So 4 parentheses. 4 times what gets me 4? 4 times 1 gets me 4. 4 times what gets me 20x? 4 times 5x gets me 20x. Didn't do anything to the bottom, so just bring that along. So now I have 4 times 1 plus 5x over 20x. Do I have anything that I can cross out? Well, 1 plus 5x is not 20x. So the only thing that I could do is reduce 4/20. So I could reduce 4/20 down into 1/5. Okay, so that would be 1 and that would be 5. So then my final answer would be 1 plus 5x over 5x. And again, we can't cancel out that 5x, even though it's very tempting. That 1 plus messes everything up. Okay, let's try example C, and then we'll call it a day. So break down the 5 into 1 and 5. Break down the 15 into 1 and 15, 3 and 5. Identify your greatest common factor is 5. Okay. Also notice though that they also share an x. So I want to pull out not just a 5 but a 5x. So then that's going to become 1, because 5x times 1 is 5x, minus 3x, because I need an x squared. I have 1x out front, so I need 1 inside to get that x squared. And 5 times 3 is 15, and it is a minus. Didn't do anything to the denominator, so bring down the 5x. Lastly, cancel out anything that looks the same, and oh look, 5x. 5x are the same, so my final answer is 1 minus 3x. All right, that concludes our 9.0 notes.